Welcome everybody to our first ever video. Today we will paint an eBay rescue rhino, which we will upgrade to a Predator tank. For the color scheme we took inspiration from the Predators in the Astartes 2 trailer. The difference is that we chose the Raptors Chapter instead of the Sons of Medusa. After applying a dark grey primer, Hull Red was used for the base coat since it's a dark but warm color. And as you can see, in between the different coats, I usually do a quick cleaning by dumping the paint and blowing the airbrush clean in a cup of water while pulling the needle back and forth. Afterwards you see me pre-shading with a pure white. You can also see me having trouble getting the white from the airbrush, probably because the paint was too thick or the PSI of the compressor was too low. I just didn't want to fuss around, so I kind of just went with it. After the pre-shading I applied a very thin coat of green, in this case Cayman green. It's important to use only thin coats, so you can see the underlying red and white, which if done correctly gives a nice depth to the paint. And then as a final step I applied a yellow wash as a tint to the green to make it pop a bit more. This because the following steps will dull down the paint quite a bit. For applying the transfers I usually put them on a wet paper towel and then use a damp brush to apply them on the model. To get them actually off the paper and align the transfers correctly, I also use a wooden toothpick. I find that it doesn't damage the transfers normally and you can move them quite a bit. What isn't shown, however, is me still having enormous amount of trouble getting the transfers off the paper. Probably because I use the microsol on the paper instead of putting the transfers on the model and then applying the microsol. I didn't really have an idea for where to put the transfers or what transfers to put on. I just went by the rule of cool. For example, the stripes on the sides I only added because I wanted to break up the green a bit. And with these stripes you can also see me having quite a bit of trouble getting the stripes off the transfer sheet and onto the model. Again, I think that is because I used the microsol on the paper instead of putting the transfers on the model first and then applying the microsol. To blend the transfers into the model, I applied chips, for which I used the same green as I used for the base coat.
Hi guys, it's me, Warhammer girlfriend. If you're watching this video and you are still not subscribed, it's time to do that. And don't forget to like this video.
And now by far the most boring part of painting is coloring all the details. You see me here using a red. I have no idea what red this actually is. It is more darker red because I'm going for a more muted tone in general. I use the same red on everything that needs to be red. Those lenses you see me paint, I will brighten up later. And for the other colors, for the blue, I used a blue where I added a bit of brown to darken the blue a bit. And for the metal, I used gunmetal from, I think, AK, it might also be Vallejo. The only thing of note is that I use airbrush paint for my metallics, so they get off the brush easier, they apply perfectly, and the coverage is usually also pretty good. The keen viewers might already have noticed that this isn't a standard Predator turret. I added some upgraded bits from the GW upgrade kit. I think the smoke launches and the antenna are from there. The tools are from the Sentinel kit from also the Imperial Guard, and the barrel is actually one of the twin barrels from the Rogaldorn battle tank. The rest is standard, but I'm not really sure. It's an extremely old kit that I had laying around and is perfect to upgrade the Rhino to Predator. The only things we will not put on are the side sponsons, because I like the more sleek look of the Rhino with the turret without those sponsons. Then the next step after that is applying a dark contrast paint over the metallic bits. This is not for the pin washing stage, that will come afterwards, but this is done to dull the metal a bit down. I use the contrast paint Rattling Grime because it has a bit of brown in it. You could use non-oil, that's just personal preference. Especially on larger surfaces, you will have to play a bit with the wash or contrast paint. You see me play and move it over the surface. This is so I stain the complete surface, and every part of the barrel has a bit of that contrast paint on it. You just have to be careful, you have to be a bit quick so you don't let the contrast paint dry. As soon as it is dry, you can't move it anymore, otherwise you remove the paint and you get these stains on the surface you don't really want to go for. To get the effect I want, I use multiple thin layers. I repeat the exact same process, I play with it a bit, I make sure that every part is stained, but I also make sure that the paint isn't too dry. As the contrast paint dries, it gets sticky and sticks to the surface. That's the moment you don't want to move it anymore. And as you can see, I wasn't really neat. You also don't have to be, because there will be many more layers on top of these, which will hide the imperfections. And there's one step that instantly takes your miniature to the next level. It's pin washing. The moment you do it, all the fine details pop, giving your model depth, definition. You got a few ways to do this. Acrylic washes, like non-oil. Easy, dry fast. Oil paints, they let you blend more. And enamel washes. These are all great. I just like the enamel washes for the great control and the precision. You see me here use the Tamiya panel liner. It's pre-mixed, flows perfectly into the recesses, and you can use it straight from the pot. Just super convenient. And if you overdo it, nothing to worry about. It's extremely easy to clean up the mistakes with white spirit or an odorless thinner. Here's a tip: if you don't clean it up completely, you're already having your first weathering step. That leftover wash creates a bit of a natural looking shadow, adds dirt, adds just overall to the realism. So in the end you can already see the result, an instant improvement with just one step. You also don't have to be afraid to damage the paint you did before. Acrylics and enamels aren't reacting to each other. If you're careful, not apply too much pressure to the brush with the odorless thinner or the white spirit on it, you will not damage the paint. Chipping is one of the best ways to make the model look better worn and better tested. If you do it right, that's a ton of realism, but it's very easy to overdo. So just let's break it down. When chipping, I focus on the areas that would take the most wear. Think of the edges, they always get the most damage. Paint chips away from the constant handling, impact and scraping. Another key spot is underneath the turret. You will see me heavily chip in those areas. Those areas take the heaviest beating from moving parts, crew, climbing in and out, so it should have the heaviest wear. And of course, anything exposed to the elements, the front, the sides, will get chipped from branches, dirt, debris, whatever. I use a couple of methods for this. Sponges work especially great for random natural looking chips. I have different sponges, some with bigger pores for rough damage and finer ones for subtle chips. To make the chips even look more realistic, I mix the light paint, but will use different parts of mix. This way I get different shade of chips. The biggest trick is actually not to overdo it. It's easy to get carried away, but less is more. A few well-placed chips tell a much better story than covering the whole thing in scratches. And for extra realism, I sometimes add a lighter highlight inside the bigger chips. It makes them look like they've gone through multiple levels of paint and adding the most depth. So basically with just a bit of careful chipping, the model goes from factory fresh to battle worn in mere seconds. And as I said, on the bottom I'm using a very heavy hand. I'm placing the chips all over. First of all, because it's in the shade, it's on the bottom, you don't really see those chips, but if you're on a certain angle, you can see those very heavy chipping effects just so slightly. If you're too light on those parts, you will not see it. Basically, you can go overboard in those parts. Now that we've done the sponge chipping, it's time to refine the details, and for this part we will use the brush. This step is for adding those deeper scratches, for the connection between the existing chips and just making the weathered look even more sharp. With a fine brush you can place more controlled scratches where the sponging doesn't quite reach. These usually work best on flat surfaces, edges, areas with a lot of wear, places where the crew would step, climb, drag gear across, etc. Think about hatches, the side of the turret, the tops of the storage boxes. These are usually all great spots for extra scratching. Anywhere with high contact will have more paint wear. I also use various pressures of my brush strokes. Those scratches are faint and barely break the surface, while others go all the way down to the base color, making them look deeper. For the deeper chips, I go back to the larger sponge marks and extend them slightly. This softens the harsh edges of the sponge application and makes the chips just look a bit more natural than just random dots. One trick is to make the chipping feel more realistic is connecting the damages. So instead of isolated chips, I add small scratches that lead into the bigger ones, almost like tiny stress fractures in the paint. This makes the paint's wear look like it's spreading over time rather than appearing in isolated spots. You can also follow the panel lines, bolt heads, etc. These areas tend to accumulate wear since they're just natural stress points. And what you could do to push the effect even further is highlighting the edges of the largest chips with a lighter color. This makes them pop and gives the illusion of depth, almost like the paint is peeling away. A trick I like to use is focusing these highlights on the lower edges of each chip. This creates then an optical illusion where the chipped paint is almost scratching the light and making the scratches look even more three-dimensional. If you want an even more realistic effect, you can combine this with an undershadow by applying a slightly darker shade underneath a chip. You then get an extra contrast and a layered effect, almost like paint is lifting off the surface. And another thing to keep in mind is variety. If every chip looks the same, it won't feel natural. Some areas should be more heavily chipped, while the others should be almost touched. For example, the bottom of the turret will have much more damage from debris kicked up by the hull, while the upper section might only have light wear from handling and exposure to the elements. A good reference always is real-life vehicles. I often look at photos of old tanks, construction vehicles, or even rusty shipping containers just to see how paint naturally wears over time. And as you can see, this final step really ties everything together, making the chipping feel intentional, adding that extra bit of realism. With controlled scratches, connecting chips, edge highlight, the weathering already looks very good. And now to make the chips even more realistic, I go in with a dark gray. By layering the darker color inside the biggest chips, it creates the illusion of exposed material underneath, and this makes the paint look like it has multiple layers rather than just being a flat surface. This is also how real metal gets scratched. There's often a difference between light surfaces wear and deeper gouges that really expose the material underneath. So this extra contrast helps separate those levels of damage and makes the model feel more authentic. I use grey instead of brown because I wanted a weathered look, not a rusted one. And by using grey, it keeps the damage looking more like chipped paint, revealing a base layer, rather than rusted corrosion heating to the surface. If you're painting a vehicle that's exposed to a lot of rain or humidity, adding rust makes sense. But for me, in this case, I'm just going for a general worn down battlefield look, and for that grey works better for the subtle long-term paint wear. If I want to go for a more rusted look, I usually use dark brown or even dark orange. It really just depends on the look you're going for. For example, if you're painting a tank that's been abandoned for years, you might want to go heavy on the rust tones. But for an active vehicle that's still in use, you mostly see worn paint and exposed metal, not full corrosion. And now it's time for another layer of weathering, this time with weathering pencils. I normally use oil or enamel products, but I wanted to try to use these weathering pencils because I read good things about them. Basically what I found was that they give you incredible control with just the pencils, a brush and a bit of water. They will reactivate no matter how much time has passed, and you can completely remove the effect. So if you don't like the effect, with some water you can remove it completely. As you can see at this stage, it's going to look pretty rough. It all will look like thick random lines, and it might feel like you're ruining your hard work until now, but really trust the process. At this moment we're just placing where we want the color difference, and they will blend into the overall weathering later. As I said, these pencils are water-based, which means you can soften the tip by just holding them in water for a few seconds. This helps apply the marks. If you want more controlled marks, you can apply these with a dry tip. Once softened, the pencil glides easily over the surface and you can make more thicker marks. Perfect if you will fatten them out later on, what we will do. For this tank, I'm using olive green pencil to add depth and grime. Since the base is a lighter green camo, dark olive creates great contrast and makes the details pop. The olive green is just perfect for adding that weathered, dirty look, especially on areas where grime would naturally accumulate, like along the panel lines, a part of the tank where it would normally build up. And now that we've added those rough pencil marks, it's time for, in my opinion, the most fun part, softening and blending everything. This is really where the magic happens and the weathering really starts to come together. One of the best things about those pencils is really how easy it is to control the amount. If you've applied too much, no worries, you can just simply go back and remove some of the damp brush. And the great thing is, if you removed too much, it's just as easy to apply more. Since again, these pencils are water-based, you can reapply them anytime and keep working until you're happy with the results. Cleaning and adjusting the marks is just super easy. You don't need to worry about any harsh chemicals or solvents, just plain water does the job. And another cool feature of these pencils is how easily you can mix the different colors to create smooth, natural blends. For example, if you used olive green, you can mix it with lighter shades, beige, yellow, and to create streaks or transitions. This is especially useful for weathering effects like dirt streaks or faded areas, where you can layer the colors and blend them to create more depth and variety. Once you're happy with the final look, I always recommend varnishing the model. This protects all the hard work you've done and seals in the effect so it doesn't get damaged during handling. A good varnish will also help the weathering effects last longer and keep the look intact. Normally you would have done this weathering step before adding the chips, but I wanted to try if I could soften the chips a bit. In the end, I think I would prefer it done before the chips. Right now the chips are not really that visible anymore, but it was a good try. Next, I'm using an animal rust wash to add a very subtle effect to a few specific chips. Now, I'm not going for a full-on rusted look, just a little bit of extra weathering in the right places. I'm being very careful with the placement here, just a light stippling over a few of the chips. I really don't want to overdo it. You can easily make the model look rusty, but I'm aiming for just a hint in those few specific spots. I also make sure to place the rust wash on areas with lighter colored surfaces, like the white undercoats, in this case the transfers, so you can really see the effect pop out. This creates contrast and draws the attentions to those worn spots. Since the wash is animal based, it's super easy to clean up any excess. All you need is a little bit of white spirit or odorless thinner, and you can remove or adjust the rust wash without damaging the base coat. This gives me almost complete control, and I can tweak it until the rust looks just right. It's a very forgiving medium. And basically for now that's it. Just a touch of rust where it's needed, adding that extra bit of depth and realism without going too much overboard. It's always a balance, and just enough to tell a story of a well-used tank, but not so much that it looks abandoned. Now it's time to add a dust effect to give the tank that final touch of realism, and for this I'm using an animal-based dust wash. The great thing about animal dust is that it's easy control and you can layer it up for a more natural look. Before I started, I asked my girlfriend what kind of weathering effect you want to go for. Should I pick snow, dirt, forest grime, dust? She picked dust, so dust it is. It's subtle, gives the model a worn-in, more outdoorsy look without being too harsh. Plus, dust is a great way to make a model look like it's been through long missions in the field. Normally you would apply this dust effect directly without any varnishing, and it will just work fine. However, I decided to add a layer of matte varnish first, because when you add the varnish, especially matte varnish, has these extremely tiny grooves in it, and this helps the animal paint stick to the surface better. So when I use white spirit to remove the excess dust, the pigment stays behind in those little grooves, which gives a very subtle faded dust effect that sticks even after cleaning. It just gives a nice consistent dusty look. Once I've applied the animal dust, I use a soft brush with white spirit to feather it out and blend it. You really don't want harsh lines, just a nice faded effect. The white spirit helps spread the pigment, but you still leave some dust residue behind, especially in those tiny grooves of those varnish and the raised areas of the model. It's a very natural, worn out look. I also like to add a bit more dust to the areas where it naturally collects. Think on top of the turret, around the cupola, near the edges where the dust would gather. These are the spots that would be exposed to the elements the most. By focusing the dust in those spots, it makes the tank look like it's been through some serious terrain without overloading the model. In the end, I like how this effect turned out. It's subtle, adds a bit of character. I typically use it on specific parts of the model, like the turret or the edges, so it's not overwhelming. In the end, it just gives the tank a nice, realistic, dusty, field-worn look. In addition to the animal-based dust, you could go back to the pencils again, because the animal and the water-based pencils don't reactivate each other. You can add different types of dust, more deeper yellows, more beige, light browns, darker browns. Make a mix and give even the dust a bit more depth. I didn't do that for this model because it isn't a display model, it will be just a playing piece. So I didn't want to do the extra effort for that, but it's all up to you. For some extra realism, I like to add streaks of dust down the sides of the tank. And I do this by start applying a small stripe of dust in the areas where I want the streak to form, usually along the edges of where dust would naturally run down. Then I take a damp brush with white spirit and use streaking motions to blend it out, pulling the dust downward. It creates a natural worn look, as if the dust has been washed away by rain of movement. It's a simple technique, but it adds a lot of character to the tank and makes it look even more weathered. To finish it off, I'm adding a small wet oil stain to the jerry can, just a tiny drop of oil paint to simulate a leak or a spill. It just gives that last detail some extra realism. Now let's add some black pigment powder to the barrel to create that exhaust fume effect, making it look like the tank has fired a lot of shells. This is a great way to add a little more realism, especially around the barrel's tip. To start, I'm using pigment powder liquid for the first 2 or 3 layers, and this liquid helps the pigment adhere better to the surface and build definition. I'll apply it to the barrel, focusing on the area that would naturally get the most build-up, so around the end of the muzzle. By doing this a couple of times, you create texture, like the soot has built up over all the times the barrel has shot. Next, I apply loose black pigment powder directly onto the barrel, and this gives it a more even look. Together with the texture on the end, it simulates buildup of the carbon from repeated firing. How much you want to apply is all personal preference. I like to use quite a bit because I like how the effect looks. It might not be realistic, but it looks amazing. And here's the finished look of the turret with all the weathering effects applied. You can see how the combination of the pit washes, the chipping, dust and the rust has really brought the tank to life. The enamel washes along with the weathering pencil work has created the depth and the realism we were aiming for. And together with the jerry can and this little oil stain, these touches just really help to tell a story. Also, you can see a sneak peek of the tank hull, showing some initial preparation work for the next video. Thanks for watching our first ever video. If you enjoyed it, it would really help us if you could like and subscribe. It means a lot and it helps brings us more content your way. Stay tuned for more.